Hey guys, thanks for tuning into this episode of the Let's Talk Tenkara podcast. I'm joined today by Jonathan Antunes out of Colorado. Jonathan, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. We look forward to getting some information from you hopefully today and learning a little bit more about yourself and fishing in Colorado.
Sure.
But let's get started with some of the basic information here. And how did you get started in Tenkara?
Uh, I got started with Tenkara pretty much by accident. I was looking at magazines. I think it was 2000, it's like the winter of 2011.
Okay.
And I started to I saw this guy, casting this rod, and it was it's a wide shot. So you could see all the line up in the air and just, it looked really nice. The rod looked very supple. And I was like, that's kind of cool. And it's like, Japanese form of fly fishing. I'm like, oh, he said the secret word, Japanese. So I'm like, I gotta get into this. Like, I don't even know what this is, but I gotta try it. And yeah, I got my first rod in July, and I took it up to the Blue Ridge Mountains because at the time I was living in Florida.
Okay.
So a trout fishing trip for me was 8 hours. And at least 8 hours for me to get up there and then, spend a weekend or, plan a whole week fishing in the Blue Ridge Mountains. So, yeah, that was July of 2011 that I started.
Perfect. You mentioned fishing in Florida, and I mean, fishing, as most people know in Florida, trout, like you said, it's not the biggest option down there. So, did you mainly target trout with Tenkara, or did you branch out into other species as well?
I branched out in the other species, but uh, it really wasn't my preferred choice. Like,
Okay.
'cause I got into trout fishing in 2005, and I had been doing the Western style for quite a while. And that all started with a trip to Wyoming. And then when I got back, I was like, I'd always been a bass fisherman. I'd done a lot of bass fishing in Florida, and it was great. But as soon as I got a taste of mountain streams and trout and how cool it was to tie flies, I was like, oh man, I'm done for. And when I got back, I was like, I my interest in bass faded very quickly.
I definitely understand that. I mean, I grew up trout fishing and have tried to branch out into bass and some other species, and I keep getting sucked back over to trout every time I try to branch out. I do fish for other species, but trout owns my soul.
Yeah, yeah.
All right,
Yeah,
so
it caught me late, but it did get me. Yeah.
yeah, and there's no turning back once it does.
No,
I mean, I guess if you move back to Florida, then you might branch back out into other things. But
I'd probably still find myself planning trips to get up to the mountains.
yeah, no, I don't blame you there, and especially when you look at, there's just something about getting out into the mountains and fishing
Mhm.
those small streams, like bass fishing, other type of fishing, crappie, bluegill, whatever it be. It's fun, but there's just something about getting out onto those little remote streams where there's nothing but trout and getting away from everything.
Yeah, absolutely. It's everything about it, like the smell of the river, and just the way that it looks. There's something very elegant about the sport.
Absolutely. So started Tenkara fishing in 2011, July.
Hmm.
Um, how long into your Tenkara journey did you feel like you were starting to finally figure it out?
It took a while, dude. Like I meandered for a long time because there wasn't really a lot of information out there. And at the time I didn't really get connected to like Facebook groups about it. So and also, I mean, coupled with the fact that I didn't really get out to trout fish very often. So, the Tenkara rods would come out, during my trips up there, and then they would go away, and I would never do anything else with them for the rest of the time. So I kind of like I was somewhat committed. Like I really enjoyed it, but at the same time, like I didn't have like the venues.
Yeah.
Um, so it just kind of like it waned a little bit. It took me forever. I finally moved to Denver, Colorado, in 2016. I want to say 2016, July of 2016, and that's when things started to really pick up. Started doing the Western thing, of course, and then there was a summit in Estes Park back when Tenkara USA was still doing their summits,
Okay. Yeah.
and that summit in particular was the big aha moment, because these people were talking about like these techniques and all these different ways of catching fish, and I was just really intrigued by the whole thing. I was like, oh man, I think I'm doing things wrong. For the longest time, I'd just been fishing with Western flies and whatever. I had a Sakasa. Let me just give you the story. This Sakasa, uh, I had tied it back like when I first started to learn about Tenkara. I never fished the thing. I just didn't even bother to fish it. It wasn't until after the summit that I was like, you know what? I'm gonna try this fly, and I'm gonna see what's up. And I'll never forget. Was on Bear Creek, which is a tiny little creek that flows into one of the tributaries for the South Platte. So it's right out here, right outside of Denver. And I was fishing there with this little Sakasa, and I had a great time. Like I was catching fish. I was starting to unlearn a lot of the dead drift type things, um, and just adding a lot of motion to my flies. And man, it worked really well. Like I was like, oh man, this is it. Like I got it. But obviously, you think the curve, right? You think oh man, I figured it out. But then it's like, oh, geez, there's a lot more to this. So you start, wading into the water, and all of a sudden it starts getting, chest deep. So,
Yeah.
so yeah,
Absolutely.
then I just sold all my Western rods. Like after that, I just didn't even want to do it anymore. I was like, okay, I'm going to commit myself to fishing this way all the time. So anytime I go, this is the way I'm going to fish, or I don't fish at all.
Love to hear it. I mean, I haven't quite made that commitment. I've still got a couple Western rods that, I mean, they're collecting dust in the closet. They haven't been used well, I take that back. I counted yesterday, and I've used my Western rod, one of them, twice in the past 3 years. And
Yeah,
it's just been for, like, I'm going to a big reservoir targeting tiger muskie.
yeah, and that would be the only reason that I would get one, is to maybe fish some of these alpine lakes a little bit differently.
Mm-hmm.
Because yeah, it's nice when they're cruising the shoreline, right? But sometimes they're not. So
Absolutely. I mean, we talked about the alpine lakes there, and I don't even take them when I do that kind of stuff. I've got 3 weights and 5 weights and an 8 weight, and the 8 weight's the only one that gets any use because, like I said, I'll use it every now and then if I'm going to the reservoir targeting tiger muskie, and other than that, it
sure,
sits in the closet.
right.
My wife actually a few weeks ago was like, "If you have these, why don't you use them, or why don't you sell them?" And I'm like, "Well, no, just in case." But
Yeah.
it's what it is. All right. Well, in your experience, what are 3 things that you wish you had learned earlier, or that you wish you knew that when you started? I mean, you mentioned your Sakasa Kabari and going more simplistic
Yeah.
later, but what are some things that you wished you had started with?
Uh, level line for sure, 100%.
I agree.
Um, I am not a fan of furled line. Um, it's heavy. It doesn't help with your presentation at all. The only time I would ever use a furled line is if it were very like, I have some that are clear, like clear furled line from Japan, and I'll use that for windy days when I'm just maybe a streamer or something like that. downstream presentations with like really big flies that I probably shouldn't be casting with Tenkara.
What?
And
That
then,
happens.
what's that?
I said, what? That never happens.
Every once in a while. It's funny because so I've gotten into the whole like classic streamers, and the classic streamers come in two flavors, right? You have the hair wing and you have the feather wing. The feather wing casts like absolute junk. I can't cast that stuff. I can't cast it with a level line. The only thing I can cast it with is a pro line, because it just catches too much wind. Now the hair wings you can cast very well, because it's not as much resistance. It's not like like casting a paddle out in the middle of.
Yeah.
So yeah, the hair wings work better in my opinion.
No,
But
I
yeah, no, I level line would be one for
so
sure. Um, the second part was just like get started, like just start unlearning, like all the stuff that you'd learned before. The thing was that I didn't see anything wrong with what I'd learned before, and the truth is there is nothing wrong. It's just a different mentality. It's a different style. Um, and I think even like traditionally, if you look back like to um, early fly fishing here in the United States, you see a lot of wet flies. Open any book by Mary Orvis Marbury, you're going to see they're all wet flies. They all have wings. They all have, they're all meant to be swung. Like sometimes you would wax the wings and make them float for a little bit, but they were wet flies, and we have really moved away from it. So much so that rarely anybody ever talks about it. You know, so yeah, getting back to more like kind of learning how to move the fly. Learning how to get these fish to react to what you're doing. Um, like diving into the technique. That I wish I would have learned that sooner. But then again, the the place wasn't great. Like I was in Florida, didn't really have much opportunity to do that with trout, and Tenkara is really really great for trout. That's where it shines.
absolutely.
So
And
that's two. What would be the third one? Oh, JDM, Japanese manufacturing. Get into those Japanese rods. The Chinese have this expression that says it must taste bitter before sweet, and I think that that was probably the case for me. Like I fished with Chinese American rods for like 7 years, and then my first Japanese rod was the Karasu 360,
okay.
and I was like, oh my gosh, what have I been doing? Like, what have I been doing? This casts so great. I Yeah, I wish I would have gotten into it a little sooner.
Oh, fair. I mean, for me, I fish American rods. I do have a Japanese rod. Actually, I have just one Japanese rod right now. I was looking at one the other day and I didn't pull the trigger on it. My wife would have shot me. But um, you know, I love my Japanese rod. I love my American rods. It has a different flavor for sure, a different feel for sure. Like you
Yeah,
said, you're gonna notice with that Japanese rod, they're a very finesse rod. They're
yeah,
gonna be a lot more smooth with the flow, and everything's gonna feel really good. And some of the American rods are gonna feel a little bit more clunky. Some a lot more than others, obviously. But it's interesting to see the difference between rods. And I set a goal for myself to fish as many rods as possible this year that are rods that I don't own. So we'll
right.
see how that goes. I want to know like what other rods are about. So
Yeah, and keep in mind that the Japanese are the ones that developed the sport. They're developing rods that are made, especially like especially like Oni, you know, he's making rods that do everything that he does well.
Yeah.
So all the manipulation techniques that he does, everything that he does on the water, um, the rod has to perform all of those things very well. So they're designed with those requirements in mind, and that's why when you get one of these in your hands, you're like, oh, this is so much easier. Like everything that I was trying to do and kind of sort of doing, now I can really do this. Like now I mean, this rod is so responsive. Like like there's times when my favorite technique is tap tap, and it
Every
gets
time.
strikes. It gets strikes. There's no doubt about it that that vibration is doing something to call up fish, and just that tapping. If you have a rod that doesn't respond very well on the tip, it will dampen what you're doing instead of quickly correcting itself. You talk about tip rotation and all that stuff. Um, a rod that is manufactured correctly, that's made for this, these specific techniques, is going to have a very fast reaction. You know, and every time you tap, that tap is going to be translated to the fly. It's not going to be dampened at all. So that's just one thing to consider, and one thing that I've noticed.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, I find it's important to make sure you have that flexible tip. Like you said, I fished cheap rods that definitely don't have that, and you definitely feel a difference. You're going to miss
Yeah.
strikes. You're not transitioning. Like you said, if you're doing tap tap or some of these other techniques, you're not going to get that transitioned into the fly as well. So that's definitely something that I've seen as well.
So here's the thing. The American rods, they serve a purpose. Okay. Um, you're going to be able to um, be forgiven a little bit for beating up that rod, because when you first get into it, you're going to break something, because those tips are so thin, and you don't really know how to work this thing. And I've seen so many. I've done it myself, where you just break a tip. It's like, I hardly did anything. Or it just flies out and it breaks. And it happens. So I think the American market, uh, it has a purpose, and the purpose is that it's getting us into the sport. You know, um, and it's more than enough for anybody, right? Um, if you're looking for mastery of the sport, you're going to have to go to the Japanese. But if you're just interested in catching fish and you're having fun, and you don't really want to put up with having to pay $50 a tip, or $50 for a section, which you probably will end up paying, with all the shipping and everything.
Yeah.
Then it's worth it to buy an American rod, and they do have their place. I carry two rods with me. My Oni Onryu 395. A rod so nice I bought it twice. I have two of them. One is a backup. And the other rod that I fish is the Hellbender by Dragon Tail. Why those two rods? The Dragon Tail I can use for nymphing. I can use with bead heads. And if I break a section, no big deal. I go and get it fixed. Bead heads, any kind of smack on the blank, and you're asking for trouble. And I just don't like to do that with my Japanese rods. My Japanese rods are specifically reserved for flies that don't have weight, and they're just regular traditional kibari, or like North Country spiders, or wet flies, or et cetera, et cetera. So more traditional techniques. Nymphing techniques, like Euro nymphing, or whatever you want, tactical nymphing, if you want to call it that. That's my Hellbender's territory, and I can count on that rod, because it's made for big fish, and I've never encountered a fish that I haven't been able to catch with my hellbender. Um, Now that I said that, it's probably been I don't mind. Uh, but like I said, it's forgiving because if you do something, if you accidentally break it, you can get it fixed. So that's
Uh,
why I carry both American and Japanese.
yeah, I carry two rods with me. They're generally both American rods, unless I'm on. I've got a few streams that I only fish my Nissen rod on because I'm not worried about overpowering that rod on those streams.
Yep,
Versus a lot of other water I fish, I am worried about overpowering that rod.
yep.
Um, but the other reason that I personally do American rods is when I'm out guiding. The
Hmm.
company that I use is Wasatch Tenkara, and their
Yep.
warranty is just too good for as a guide. I can't pass that up.
Yeah, no, it's probably one of the better warranties in the business.
Absolutely.
I haven't seen anybody put up like that.
Yeah.
That's
I mean,
that's the real deal.
I've heard of multiple people. Well, actually, multiple people being two people have broke rods on a fish,
Hmm.
and they replace the section, no questions asked.
Yep.
And to me, that's phenomenal. For a guide, they give me a little bit extra insurance where if my client breaks my rod bashing it on a tree, they'll hook me up as well. But
Yeah. Yeah,
so,
that makes a lot of sense to me.
yeah, exactly. And then, like I said, I do have my Nissen rod. I fish it on my smaller streams that are made, or that rod is made for, and
Mhm.
I love it. But then I've got those other situations where the big rods are just the option.
Right.
But so I definitely understand having two rods. I mean, you always want to have backup if nothing else, right?
Oh yeah, and
And work.
I have a lot of smaller stream rods. You know, most of them are JDM, but it's just the preference
Yeah,
of fishing the headwaters you know with Japanese equipment.
absolutely. No, and that makes a lot of sense. Let's get into flies a little bit more. We talked about some different streamers. You mentioned bead heads and the Sakasa.
Yep.
What is your go-to fly?
An old fly from the 1800s called the Cutcliffe.
Okay.
It is, and people give me that look whenever I tell them, especially when I'm catching fish at the South Platte, because that's not what they expected to hear.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody would expect to hear that one. It's one of those. It's one of those flies that you can do a lot with. It's a stiff hackled fly. You can tie it. You tie it mostly with rooster, and I like to use either Gallo de Leon or India rooster uh, neck.
Okay.
And those particular flies, they look very bushy on here, very bushy looking. And all it is really, it looks like a caddis. Um, it has no tail, and nearly all of them have absolutely no tail at all. Uh, but they're very bushy, and they're tied. They're tied by folding the hackle, and you fold it backwards. So that hackle is kind of like facing in the revert in the like a wet fly.
Hmm.
And really, what these are stiff hackled wets. And what I'm doing with this is I'm fishing them right along the top, sometimes in the surface, and just giving them motion. You know, uh, sometimes upstream, but mostly downstream. Um, it's a lot like an older style of fly fishing that they call dibbling, which is you're basically using a long rod and you're using that length to in a light line to be able to keep that fly on the surface. And there's a very similar technique that involves wind, um, where you're dapping the fly, and it's very common to see that like on locks, in the the British Isles. You get a lot of wind on those locks, and that that light line is made of floss. And what happens is that fly is just kind of, bouncing in and out of the surface. And that kind of activity is just irresistible to fish. Um, and that's basically what I'm doing here. I mean, not necessarily the wind part, although that does happen. Where it gets so windy, like you can't really do anything except for that.
Yeah.
But man, it works. As soon as that fly just dips right back down into the water, man, they're on it. So, um, so what I'll do with that fly is the fly is really not. It's very easy to tie. It's very simple. But what I'm doing with the fly is the real like rubber meets the road type thing. I tie all my flies with action in mind or with a purpose in mind. Um, what do I want to do with this fly? Like, how do I want it to move? How do I want it to look? Um, and I'll go through that process. And these particular flies, I didn't invent them, but I have done things with them to make them more interesting. Um, Personally, to me, like just adding new materials and materials that weren't really around when Cutcliffe was alive, in the mid 1800s. Um, and that's kind of, it's given me a little bit of room to play with. Um, but it's an amazing technique. I'm basically casting across, like down and across. Sometimes I vary my angles because the wider the angle, the faster that fly is going to move. Right. The shallower the angle, then that fly just kind of stays in place. And then you can kind of work it in the current up and down. You can either bounce it or you can just kind of drag and tap. And that drag and tap is probably where I catch most of my fish. And
Okay.
seeing this fish like breach the water, to come out and grab this fly and it's exciting. It's really exciting. That's just a straight line. The other way that I fish this fly is with a dropper. So I'll have maybe about a foot of line down to my tag, my point fly. A point fly can be any kind of wet fly, whatever you want. It could even be a smaller Cutcliffe. Um, and then off of a dropper, about 6 inches off of the main line is going to be another one, and that other one is bushier. It's definitely made to be just kind of like dipping in the water, right? And I don't know if you've ever seen like yellow sallies when they try to hatch,
Mhm.
or even like caddis that are just kind of trying to lay their eggs. It's pretty erratic, and they sometimes they'll get stuck in the film, and they just kind of like sit there and try to break out of it.
Yeah.
And that's absolutely the trigger, that vibration. Um, because your point fly is holding the tension out here, and then you've got that one dangling down, and it's just kind of dipping its butt, into the water. It's lights out. That's incredible to watch. Like I've seen like 18-inch rainbows, like you know, just come right out of the water to grab this thing, and it, those those things keep you up at night. You just like start thinking about it. It's like, man, I really want to, I want to go again. It's just exciting stuff.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's a technique that I haven't heard of people doing with Tenkara. People do it with fly fishing, like you said.
Yep.
Never even thought to bring that over, and I might have to try that this year.
Well, uh, so history kind of tells you the story of how this technique kind of like died down, and mostly it was because the adoption of like a short rod, short rod, heavy line, weighted line to be able to cast, and mostly for dry flies, right? So the whole dry fly thing really kind of sidetracked this, and also just these short rods. Um, you know, in the 1800s, it was very common to see an 18-foot rod. Um, Cutcliffe, in particular, preferred a 12-foot to a 14-foot. Um, Personally, I prefer either 13 or 14. 13 is pretty good, in my opinion. I think you can get pretty much anything that you want done. with a 13-foot rod. But that's very recent. I mean, it's recent that we have that ability again. You
Mhm.
know, because even the biggest Euro nymphing rod tops out at 11 foot. So I've got an extra 2 feet of play. And that angle is really important. Like getting that fly up and out of the water is like one of the things that really uh, make this the presentation work. So yeah, it's like history, kind of like you know long rods. It's like all the rage, and then all of a sudden, it's like split cane, and got all these tiny little rods, and everything got really small, and stayed that way for a long time. And now I think we're headed in the right direction. I think I would love to see somebody develop a rod that was, like a fly rod, but 12 to 13 foot. If
So
we could
I
just kind of
actually,
move away from the whole Euro nymphing
yeah,
competition thing and all the regulations that come with that, and just kind of like experiment. Hey, let's make these really long rods, but like light, like 3 weights, 4 weights,
yeah.
that'd be
So
great.
I was actually at a fly fishing expo back in April,
Oh,
and there was a fly company there that had a 15-foot rod.
really?
Yeah, and I was
Oh,
shocked to see that
that's
because
exciting.
yeah, hadn't seen one that long on the fly western fly fishing side of the world. I mean, we see them in Tenkara,
Yeah.
but yeah, I talked to him for a while, and it was cool to see something that long. It was a heavier rod, but I mean, still, we're starting to see those longer lengths come back, like you said, which
Sure.
will be interesting to see how people start to adapt and use them.
Well, that's a funny thing because the salmon anglers know about this technique. They know about dibbling. They know about all of that stuff because they still have long rods.
Hmm.
So their ability to do that um, is not hampered at all. They've still been able to do this, and it's kind of lived on in the salmon world. Um, so yeah, uh, long rods would be awesome. I would love to see like a 3 weight or a 4 weight in like a 14, 15 foot, even like 13 would be perfect.
That'd be pretty sweet. I'm not even
Yep.
going to argue that at all.
Yep.
Uh, so, what would you say is your most memorable experience with Tenkara?
Mm. There's one that I keep coming back to. So I just received my Japanese rod, and I was fishing. We were fishing in Rocky Mountain National Park. We actually had a group of guys come together, and they were from all over, including Japan. Goichi was there with us, and it was fun. Like we had a lot of fun, and um, I had that rod, and I just took it. This was my first time fishing with it, and I went with my buddy Peter Root, who runs uh, 10 Colors Tenkara blog.
Okay.
I don't know if you're familiar with it.
Huh. I'll have to look into
It's a blog that's kind of separate from Facebook. It's a nice group. Uh, People usually have some really interesting subjects to talk about. But anyways, I went fishing with Peter, and we went to the Big Thompson in Rocky Mountain National Park. It's a smaller river, but man, I'll tell you what, that evening was spectacular. Uh, I caught 42 fish in the space of 3 hours. It was exciting. I mean, and I missed so many fish. Um, but man, I tell you what, it was just like, this is great. Like this rod is incredible. It casts really well. The loops are nice and tight. I was like, this is insane. Like stuff that I was not able to do with my American type rods. I was doing with ease. And my buddy and I, he caught like 40 fish, and we were slamming them. It was really exciting. Uh, Yeah, and that's that place. That place, sadly, I think it was a year ago now. Was part of the one of the fires that happened here in Colorado. It's like Troublesome Creek.
Okay.
Yeah, Troublesome Creek fire like basically went over the mountain and down that canyon and just like burned everything, you know. And that is it's sad. Um, but you know, I always remember what that place looks like in my head. I may never see it like that ever again. And that's why that memory is kind of special for me, you know, because it's like it's like that home you can't go back to,
Yeah.
you know. Yeah.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, it's cool that you have that memory, though, even though, like you said, it may never look like that again, at least not in our lifetime, right?
Yep.
But it's cool that you're able to reflect back on that and remember what it was, and hopefully the fishing will return to what it was once things balance back out in the area.
It still gets kind of green, but you know, it's definitely not what it used to be. You
Yeah.
know, the
All right.
fishing's still good.
Well, that's good news. Let's talk a little bit more about Tenkara in Colorado specifically.
Yeah.
So you mentioned you're in the Denver area. Are you mostly fishing like taking trips up into the mountains? Or are you fishing more local? Like what does a fishing trip look like for you?
Um, so it's really I've kind of dedicated myself for the last year and a half, maybe even 2 years, to learning how to catch fish in a very like very unusual ways at on the South Platte.
Okay.
So I do take a lot of trips to Deckers, um, and you know I fish that water quite often, and so does everybody else. Uh, it's definitely overpressured, and that's what makes it kind of challenging and fun. Because the fish have really never seen presentations like what I'm showing them. So they're, you know, I'm pretty sure that they're taken by surprise when they, you know, when they see this fly just kind of fluttering up at the top, and they're like, "Oh, that can't be. It can't be another, you know, can't be another perdigon. Definitely not."
No, and I do think it's funny. A, a lot of fly fishermen, I mean, we talked about beforehand, like the Provo River and things like that. And
Yeah,
that river gets fished harder than any other river in the state of Utah. But you get out there with these different presentations, these different flies, and all of a sudden you're catching fish, and it's just
yeah.
like they just don't see it. Like they get fished hard all day, every day, but you throw something that they haven't seen, and all of a sudden you're catching fish.
It's also really subtle.
Hmm.
The techniques are just they're subtlety themselves. It just no there's no presentation that does this that you know basically keeps all your line off the water.
Yeah.
And that's so I the one of the reasons why I wanted to fish Deckers and South Platte and get really good at it is because that's probably one of the most pressured pieces of water in Colorado. So if I can fish that and get somewhat good at doing it with Tenkara, then you know everything else is kind of a piece of cake, you know. And so far, you know, aside from a few eccentricities, you know, different bugs and different waters, you know, and also like sometimes you would think, no, this isn't going to work here, and oh yeah, it does work, you know. Um, so there's that's kind of why I focused on that. But I mean, I fished the Big Thompson a lot, especially during the runoff, which is happening right now. Big Thompson is really nice because there's so much water coming down a very narrow chute. And because of that, none of the trout can hang in the middle. So during the runoff period, you know, I'll fish with, you know, big onis, like, you know, size eight onis, and just cast them in there and really get, you know, get a bunch of fish to react to those, you know, because they're really dark flies, you know, big hackle, and they just get a lot of attention. So those fish are all hugging near the corners. That's kind of one of the things that I like to fish. I like to fish Big Thompson during the runoff because of that. Because I can stick right to the edge and just go to every single eddy, every single pool, and just fish that, um, and catch a lot of fish during the runoff period.
Absolutely. So sounds like you're mainly, not hitting too much mountain stuff, just staying pretty local. Is that right?
You know, anything within 2 or 3 hours is fair game.
Okay.
So I've been up to haven't been up this year to the frying pan, but man, the frying pan is a lot of fun. Used to go there in July or August, and man, it's incredible. It's an incredible fishery, and believe it or not, the onis, big onis, like with like a dark body, and the church window feathers from a ringneck pheasant, just that
Okay.
big old white and brown and black
Yeah.
feather. I can't, man, that fish is so well there. I don't know what it is that they think that is. Maybe they think it's a green drake. I don't know. But they love that fly there. Um, so that's a dry fly. That's a dry fly stream. It's like everybody goes there to fish dry flies. I'm like the only schmuck, sitting there with a Tenkara rod, fishing wet flies, just because it works.
Yeah, absolutely.
They've seen enough dries already. They know what that looks like. Um, what else? I get into the alpine lakes a little bit. Just right here along this range, we have the Indian Peaks, and Indian Peaks have some really nice alpine lakes, giant cutthroat. Um, some of them are just impressive, and I've fished those with fixed line before. Um, like I said, I would like to get maybe a rod for that, rod and reel, just to be able to cast a little bit further and do some of the techniques that I've been reading about. But other than that curiosity, I seem to do pretty well just with fixed line.
Absolutely. Especially you get into a lot of the alpine lakes, and they're not big lakes in the aspect of a lot of the ones that you see down in valleys and stuff,
Yeah.
right? And so you get a lot more fish, like we were talking about earlier, just cruising the shorelines, and you're able to be very productive that way.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
it's
And
nice.
like I said, it's such a light presentation that they never see it coming.
Absolutely. So we've talked a lot about trout. We talked a little bit about how you came from a bass fishing background. What
Yes.
are the species that you've yet to target with Tenkara that you want to, if any?
Species that I want to catch for Tenkara.
Yeah,
Basically any trout that I don't have here. So
fair.
goldens, I would love to catch goldens. Um, that's probably number one on my list is to catch golden trout. In their area. Not we have goldens here, but it's not the same. They're stocked.
Mhm.
Um, what else? Grayling. Would love to catch grayling. Again, we have grayling here. They're very small, but we do have them. And man, like all the trout in Japan. I would love to go to Japan and fish that. I went in 2001, but I really wasn't into Tenkara. I wasn't into fly fishing. I was just kind of stuck on bass. I didn't even realize that Japan had like a bass scene. But they're like their bass scene is serious, really serious. You know, but that trip I didn't do any fishing at all. So I would love to go back to Japan and fish there.
That'd be a very fun trip. And I,
Hmm.
like I said, didn't realize that they had a bass scene in Japan. So that's news
So
to me.
it's serious. They actually some of the lures that they come up with are definitely like next level stuff. Like because their waters are very very pressured.
Yeah,
So they're constantly changing up what their baits look like and their techniques and it's pretty cool. Like the Japanese stuff coming out for bass is really really interesting. And
oh, absolutely. All right. So as we get back into the Tenkara away from the bass fishing here,
yeah,
uh, what does an ideal trip look like in Colorado?
If you really want to experience Tenkara, you have to head up into the mountains. You know, if that's if your goal is to fish, traditional kebari or things of that nature, you're really going to want to go to a mountain stream. Some of the best mountain streams that we have here, they're not very far away, and they receive very little pressure because nobody wants to make the hike. Uh, so there's tons of them here. And you can there's plenty of them that you can actually camp right next to them, and that's a perfect, in my opinion, it's a perfect weekend for just get up there and spend a long weekend and fish that water. If you have the luxury of fishing during the week, do it. Because it's going to be even less people up there. Um, there are a few rivers here that have brookies. Unfortunately, uh, the push west also brought the brookies with all the settlers because cutthroat really don't produce as fast. Um, so they emptied out all the cutthroat, ate them all, and they're like, "Well, we need something to replace these," so they replaced them with brookies. So if you can really get to a stream that has cutthroat in it, that's really like the treasure. If you can catch brookies all day long, get really bored of them. There's a lot of brookies here. But once you get into a stream that has cutthroat, it's really nice to see how interesting they are. They really are a very beautiful fish.
Absolutely. I mean, we're fortunate in Utah. We have 3 subspecies of cutthroat here.
Hey, sorry. Sorry.
You're good.
He's
But
protecting me.
oh yeah, letting you know, right?
He's like an ankle biter, but he does his best.
Yeah, but we are fortunate. We have 3 subspecies of cutthroat in Utah. One of them being the Colorado cutthroat.
Yep.
We do have the Bonneville cutthroat, as
Yep.
well as, I guess, technically 4 subspecies. The Bear Lake cutthroat, which is a subspecies of Bonneville cutthroat, and then the Yellowstone cutthroat as well. So we're fortunate here. I've caught 2 of the 4 subspecies. I've got to get my
Nice.
Yellowstone and my Bear Lake still, but I've got the Colorado and the Bonneville. I mean, I've got a Bonneville Creek 15 minutes away from my apartment, so it's convenient.
Yeah, it's we had kind of a snafu here with the cutthroat because we thought that we had like a while back they thought they had greenbacks. They thought they had found this population of greenbacks. So they started stocking everywhere. You know, Rocky Mountain National Park got quite a bit of this. And they still put up the signs, "Hey, these are greenbacks." No, they are not. They are Colorado cutthroat, unfortunately.
What's funny,
Um,
pretty sure I watched a video, I think it was last year or the year before, of someone on a Tenkara trip in Colorado that they're like, yeah, we're going in to catch the greenback cutthroat. And
are you though? Are you sure about that?
maybe to the
Yeah,
best of their knowledge.
yeah. I guess there's they're hard to tell the difference. But am I going to say that they're not there? I can't. But there's definitely certain places that have been stocked and are somewhat isolated. In fact, they're trying to do that with the headwaters of the Hooter, which are still in pretty good condition. Everything underneath the Cameron Peak fire is pretty messed up. Like there was a lot of ash that made its way into the river, and it killed, I don't know, like 60% of the trout population. So yeah,
A
but
common,
up above it was good. So they're trying to get that area ready for introduction of the greenback, and it'll be kind of cool to see.
yeah, that'd be really cool to watch it hopefully grow and flourish out there. I mean, you talk about 60% of the fish being killed off in a waterway. That unfortunately, it's a common trend with fires that happens all too regular these days.
Yeah.
Thankfully, in Utah, we got that heavy winter that we're all dreading, but we needed. A lot of the western states are in the same boat with that, unfortunately, but we needed the moisture, so I guess it's fortunately, unfortunately, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, and who knows how many years it was like this, and we're just so used to the drought that we've never really seen what Colorado or Utah or any of our western states can really push out. At least
Absolutely.
I haven't. I'm sure some of the older old timers can tell you.
Yeah, I mean, the last time Utah saw winter this heavy was, I believe, 83. And
Yeah.
so that's before my time, especially my time in Utah. I moved here in 2017. So definitely not like I know what an average year other than the past 6 years have looked like.
Yep.
All right. So if someone's planning to take a trip to Colorado, what should they know beforehand?
So you're going to be told to it really depends on when you're coming, because there's certain times of the year where you're not going to be able to fish a big fly, like a size 12, just it's too big. However, that being said, during the summertime is probably the best. Any time like early July, uh, after the runoff is done, um, July and August and even September are absolutely stellar. Probably some of the best fishing. The further you get into autumn, the better it gets. Like, because those fish really, they feel that cold water coming, and they really start to pack on the pounds. So um, they feed voraciously. If you're coming to Colorado, uh, make sure that you're ready for anything, especially if you're going to the Alpine Lakes or any kind of high altitude, because it could rain one minute, be sunshine, snow the next, lightning, hail, everything. You really have to be prepared, because these mountains will throw just about anything at you, at any point during the day. I mean, it can literally snow here any day of the year.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's kind of what you get when you go up that high. Um, but I mean, other than that, there's still fish. Everybody talks about intelligent trout. There's no such thing. We're overthinking it. Really, what we need to do is learn your skill very well. Learn Tenkara very well. Um, if you're doing the dead drifting thing and it's working out for you, that's great. You know, there's other ways to catch fish, and some of those ways are like really really fun. Um, like you'll be laughing every single time you catch one, because it's hysterical to watch what these fish will do. Um, you know, for a technique that is it's different. It's older. Um, it's an older world style. You know, so learn what you can about that. Learn everything there is about it. If you the more you have, the more skills you have, the more ability you have, the less gear you're going to need. Does that make sense? You've got all these tools, but the tools are just techniques. You know, and fly might not work one way, but you switch it up and you do something else, all of a sudden it's like a light switch.
Yeah.
Um, I can tell you that right now. Like anytime I swing a fly, if I swing it just regular with nothing, um, I might catch a fish. I might, it probably will not happen, because it's not the right type of motion. As soon as I start adding just any kind of like tapping or kind of like jigging motion. I mean, it's like all of a sudden they're into it, you know. And all it took was just knowledge and understanding of, okay, now what can I do with this fly? How can I fish this fly in a different way? Same fly in a different way, to make it more appealing for the fish. And that's, if you come to Colorado, come prepared. Um, it's a fun place to fish. It really is. And the fish here are still pretty dumb, and they still don't know what Tenkara is. They're like, I don't know what this is. This is crazy. This thing looks real. I don't, I don't know what's real anymore.
Man, dumb fish are my favorite fish.
Yeah.
It's like anytime you get further than 15 minutes away from a city, you find the dumb fish.
Oh yeah. Well, it's funny because people talk about the South Platte. It's like, oh, those fish are really educated. They see all kinds of flies. I'm like, um, maybe if you're fishing the traditional style, the conventional style of fly fishing, yeah, they probably have seen everything. You give them this, you give them tenkara, you give them something that they haven't seen, and they'll go nuts. Uh, they'll lose their minds.
Yeah, love to hear it. All right, kind of wrapping up here. Is there anything that you feel like we should have talked about that we haven't talked about?
Um, yeah. So you were asking me about bass fishing.
Oh, yes.
And uh, you can include this, you can cut it out, whatever you want to do.
Yeah.
But bass fishing in particular is actually a really good starting point for understanding tenkara. And one of the reasons for this is because of those techniques. I mean, you know, um, it's jigging. You're basically jigging. You're basically start. So a lot of people think of trout as like this, very gentle sipping creature, that comes up. Of course, we've learned that they'll take streamers, they'll eat mice off the top of the water. They're not shy; they just want food. Um, so if you kind of start thinking about trout the way you do a bass, right, and just think of them as a predatory animal, but instead now start thinking about your flies like lures, right? So your flies are, you're basically trying to mimic a struggling prey image, okay? And if there's one thing about predators is that they take the opportunity for to attack a wounded prey because they're easier.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I think we get wrapped up with is we think that, oh man, these flies are coming out perfect. Every single one of these flies coming off the bottom of the water is absolutely perfect. They swim perfect. They, of course, we know that's not true either. Many of them are missing legs from stone flies that have tried to eat them, or other mishaps, or whatever. And they're some of them really can't swim very well. They're trying to make it up to the top, and they get picked off. And I think we gotta have to start thinking about these tiny little insects. Like, okay, this is how can I make this seem like this insect's really struggling to hatch? Um, and if you can do that, if you figure them out, because some insects will hatch quicker than others, some behave in a different way when they hatch. Um, then you can start kind of piecing together these little these techniques that you can do that kind of make things more appealing to the fish, and it matches very precisely what you're doing with the blue winged olive. For instance, like the blue winged olive, that's that fly, that little insect moves so quick. It is very very fast, and it's an amazing little fly because that nymph's just shooting, And there's sometimes when I can't drag that fly across the water fast enough. they'll intercept it. And then there's other times where, if I slow that down a little bit, it works a little bit better. They can track it easier and they catch it better. How many times have you like lifted up the rod to a back cast and all of a sudden the fish, either
Happens
strikes it,
all the time.
and that's a fast motion,
Mm-hmm.
and that's, you have to start thinking to yourself, man, they're used to that. They're used to something that quick. These fish can go 0 to 60 in, I don't know how many seconds. They're really, really quick.
Yeah.
So no bug is really a challenge for them, right? I mean,
Well,
if you think about it that way.
it's one of those things where, like, you watch YouTube videos, or I'm sure you've had the same experience I have, where you go out, you hear it on the YouTube videos as well. They go to, like you said, they set the hook, and it's like, oh, I had a fish on. I didn't realize there was a fish there. More than likely, that fish wasn't on. It bit, like you said, as you were going to move the fly.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. In fact, there's a really old technique, and when I say old, I mean really, really old. We're talking about the 1500s. This is in England. A guy by the name of Richard Venables wrote a book called The Experienced Angler. Right? And in this book, he has, in the 4th edition, he has this weighted fly, and it's a cad bait, he calls it, which is really a caddis. And what he's done with this is he's tied it with silk, right? And black silk, but over the silk he wraps, or under the silk on the hook he wraps lead, right? So he flattens this piece of lead out, and he wraps it around the shank of the hook, and then he takes the silk and he covers that, and then he takes beeswax, and then he covers that, and he takes, makes a little body of the cad bait, with a black head made of wax. So what he does with this thing is he fishes this weighted fly. He fishes this by casting it upstream, letting it sink down, and then he pulls it up, and then he lets it sink back down again. And he maybe gets two times of doing this. He just pulls it up, and as he's pulling it up, that's when he says that you're probably going to get a strike if there's a fish in there at all. This is the first time you see anybody talking about a weighted fly, especially a fly that was built with the lead wrapped on the shank of the hook. This is in the 1500s. You don't see this again for 300 years.
Yeah.
Incredible stuff, right? But there it is, that manipulation technique. And what do you think this guy was using? He was using a fixed line rod. And pretty much, if you go back into history and you start reading these guys, Charles Cotton, Juliana Berners, Venables, Richard Bulker. You start getting these really cool things that they're doing, like the whole tap thing. Man, they had that figured out. They already knew it.
Yeah.
They were doing stuff. One of the most important things that they said is that when you're fly fishing, to always keep your fly in motion.
I mean, I very rarely dead drift a fly. Like I said, I'm always doing tap or something there.
Yeah.
I might be bobbing my rod a little bit. Like you
Yeah.
said, jigging. I'm glad that you brought that up, actually. Like, I was in shock. It was about 2 years ago, and I was fishing this spot that I fished hundreds of times.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd caught fish in this same spot almost every time I fished there. And for some reason that day, they just were not biting. And I'm just like, what the heck? Like, I see fish in here. I catch fish in here all the time.
Yeah.
And I'm a firm believer that before I change my fly, I'm going to figure out what I'm doing wrong, because that's more than likely what the issue is.
Sure.
And so I ended up just moving a little bit I moved to the head of the pool instead of the tail of the pool, and flipped to the tail and started jigging it back up towards me. And all of a sudden the fish were biting. And it was the first time I'd ever done that with the Tenkara rod. And I'm just like, why have I not done this before?
Yep. The eyes open. It's like, oh man, I need to be doing this more often. Yeah.
Like there's a whole avenue to this that I hadn't even explored yet.
Yeah. And I really think that, it's funny because I get a lot of flack sometimes from Western anglers, for doing what I'm doing. But it's really their sport, right? Just the older form of it, you know.
Yeah.
This is where fly fishing began. For thousands of years, it was this. It was this way. It was the only way that you were ever going to fish with a fly.
Yep.
So, and for that long a period of time, this style has never gone out of circulation. There's never a point in history since it began that fly fishing with a fixed line setup was not being practiced. So if you think about that, I mean, this is the oldest, one of the oldest forms of fishing. Definitely the oldest forms of fly fishing. So their history, it's really, what we're doing is what is the history of their sport too.
Yeah.
Just it's just interesting how things have kind of full circled. But there's so many things to learn. There's so many interesting things that you can do with this. I just sometimes I wish they could kind of like give it a shot. See what there is to learn, because there's a lot.
Absolutely. Well, we are out of time today, unfortunately. I think I might have to have you back on in the future because I feel like we still have a lot that we could talk about here.
Mm-hmm.
But thank you very much for joining me today, Jonathan. Where can people follow your Tenkara journey?
So on Instagram, Trout Conjurer, all one word. Or you can just find me on Facebook. Just look up my name.
Perfect. Well, thank you again. I really appreciate you coming out. For those of you that are listening, we are still looking for a handful of people to fill the other 50 states. We've got 4 down at this point. And thank you again, Jonathan, for hitting Colorado for us. If you are interested in coming in on a future episode of the podcast, reach out to me on Instagram or via email. You can find me on Instagram at Let's Talk Tenkara, or shoot me an email at Let's Talk choking over my words there. Let's Talk Tenkara at gmail.com. Thanks again, Jonathan, and tune in next time.
Thank you, Brendan.
This has been the Let's Talk Tenkara podcast, hosted by Brendan Harden. Special guest, Jonathan Antunes. You can find Jonathan on Instagram at Trout Conjurer. You can reach us on Instagram at Let's Talk Tenkara. You can also shoot us an email at letstalktenkara@gmail.com. Feel free to reach out with any suggestions for future episodes. Feel free to reach out if you're interested in being featured on the podcast. You can reach out to us again on Instagram at Let's Talk Tenkara, or shoot us an email. This has been the Let's Talk Tenkara podcast, a Salt Lake Tenkara production.